Vi befinner oss på Engelsbergs bruk i Bergslagen där årets Engelsbergsseminarium äger rum. Temat är Leadership and Statecraft och i det pass vi nu ska få ta del av ligger fokus på individuella ledargestalter där namn som de Gaulle, Adenauer, Kennedy och Thatcher kommer att förekomma.
Every man of action has a strong dose of egotism, pride, hardness and cunning. But all those things will be forgiven him. Indeed, they will be regarded as high qualities if he can make of them the means to achieve great ends. Julian Jackson, is that Machiavelli?
You tell me. I don't know. It's very well, of course, I don't dare to say it's very Machiavellian because we were told yesterday that Machiavelli was not a Machiavellian. So I have to be careful on that.
You want me to tell you who it is?
It's de Gaulle.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I knew it was de Gaulle, but he could have been quoting from Machiavelli. If you've seen the presidential picture, official photograph of Emmanuel Macron, you'll see that it has him in the Elysee. It's leaning against a desk with the Elysee Gardens behind him. And there's one book open on the desk behind him, and it's the Memoir de Guerre, the war memoirs of de Gaulle. I've tried endlessly to blow it up and blow it up and blow it up to see what page he chose to have it open on, because clearly it was not a coincidence. He chose it. We also know that just behind there's Stendhal's Le Rouge et Noir, and just behind that there's Gide, but only what book we can see is de Gaulle. So de Gaulle clearly still seems for the French to matter. He's an unusual person when we're talking about leadership in that he was a leader, he was an exceptionally cerebral leader. He wrote and thought about leadership long before there was any chance he was going to do it. In the 20s and 30s, when he was a relatively young man, he wrote. And very cerebral. The people he cites in the various books he writes about leadership, just a few names: Goethe, Bergson, Francis Bacon, Tolstoy, Maeterlinck, Heine, Rousseau, Nietzsche, Racine, Cicero. Heine I've mentioned again. Not, curiously, Machiavelli, who would seem to be an obvious one to be in the list. What are, in de Gaulle's view, the characteristics? What vision of leadership emerges from these writings in the 1920s and 1930s? I'm not going to quite do the John Bew 10 points. I'm going to just think of 8 points, but this is a rather cursory summary. It's a very bleak vision. One, the leader needs to show aloofness, mystery, ruse, hypocrisy. And the leader must impose upon himself solitude. It's, I quote, unceasing self-discipline, the constant taking of risks, a perpetual inner struggle. He compares the plight of the leader to the hair shirt of the penitent. The self-control of the leader to that of a gambler, quote, whose elegance consists in reinforcing his outward appearance of sang-froid at the moment he takes the winnings. So this is a very bleak, austere vision of leadership. 2, the leader must not get drowned in detail. Information overload we heard about this morning. Solitude is necessary for reflection. Leave the details to others. A very famous quote of de Gaulle is "L'ordonnance suivra." The supply chain will follow. Leave the supply chain to the people who deal with it. And the leader needs the solitude for vision. Thirdly, the fundamental importance of contingency and circumstances. He gets this actually from William James and a man called Émile Boutroux, the pragmatists and so on. Quote, in every form of action, military and political and industrial, the essential role of the leader is to appreciate the nature of the circumstance in every particular case. Action must be constructed on contingency. He wrote a book on the reasons why the Germans lost the First World War, and one of his reasons was that the German High Command was in 1914 obsessed by what he called a priori doctrine. They had not taken account of the evolution of circumstances. Fourth point, the leader in his solitude his vision that he develops in solitude needs to be underpinned by a deep general culture and an understanding of history. He used to say sometimes as a sort of joke, I've been saying it for 1,000 years, but nobody's listened. So history is essential to de Gaulle's view of the world. He wrote in one of those books also, behind all Alexander's victories lies Aristotle. So intelligence, thought, reflection. Fifthly, though, intelligence is not enough. And one of the key influences on de Gaulle was the turn of the century French philosopher Henri Bergson, best known for the idea of élan vital. But Bergson was writing against the positivism of the 19th century and reintroducing ideas of instinct and that intellect is not enough. And so de Gaulle says, Bergson explains the role of intelligence and analysis. He saw how necessary it is to analyze questions in search of truth. But, key quote, intellect alone cannot act. The intelligent man does not automatically become a man of action. Instinct is also important. Instinct plus impulse. But impulse alone is not enough as a basis of action. The two to go together, instinct and impulse. Sixth theme, the rational organization of society. De Gaulle was writing these works at a time when there was a lot of talk about management science, Fordism, Henri Fayol, how the modern industrial society needed to be organized more rationally. And for de Gaulle, curiously, the exemplar of rational organization was Louis XIV's Minister Louvois, who played a great role in the modernization of the Ancien Régime army. For de Gaulle, Louvois is a kind of proto-énarque, you could say. Number 7, mesure, that intranslatable French word, which means restraint, which means being aware of possibilities, not, as you were, overdoing things. He wrote in one of the books that the ideal of the classical French garden, the organized classical French garden, as opposed, and this is the book where he wrote about the defeat of the German army in 1918, he explains that defeat by Nietzschean overreach, as opposed to that sense mesure that the French have. He admired the Ancien Régime for its sense of the possible, and he had a very low view of Napoleon, because Napoleon never knew where to stop. Napoleon was an example of excessive overreach. And eighth point, he was also very influenced by a figure a little bit rather forgotten today, but a man who influenced actually Freud, Theodore Roosevelt, Mussolini, Hitler. I don't know whether you've guessed who I'm talking about. Gustave Le Bon, the famous crowd psychologist of the early part of the century, who had developed a whole theory about the emotionalism of the crowd. The crowd is actually feminine. The crowd needs to be controlled by the masculine leader. And there's a lot in de Gaulle around this idea that crowds alone, that masses alone don't know what to do. They need to be led. You have to take people. So he says the leader's authority is not susceptible to rational analysis any more than love, which is explicable only as the action of inexpressible charm. Now, some of that almost sort of sounds Hitlerian, his relation in the 30s, 20s when he's talking about the crowd. But with de Gaulle, he says you've got to take the people with you by explaining. Didacticism, explaining your actions, taking the people with them is a very important part of the philosophy. Explaining, giving a narrative. So I suppose you want to sum all this up. It's a kind of curious mix of rationality and sentiment, of classicism and romanticism, of calculation and provocation, of cunning and showmanship, Descartes, but also Bergson, Cavour, but also Mazzini. He's a very Cavourist operator, but with a Mazzinian, if you want to say, Bergsonian spark. A kind of romantic id, as it were, the Bergsonian bit, kept in check by a classical ego, the mesure, hold back, don't go too far. We could also say sort of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Final quotation, the reason why this is why the greatest qualities of intelligence do not suffice. Undoubtedly, intelligence helps, and instinct pushes one, but in the last resort, a decision has a moral element, moral courage. And he quotes Fisher, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Fisher, who said about Nelson, said about Jellicoe, Admiral Jellicoe, that Jellicoe had all the qualities of Nelson, bar one, he did not know how to disobey. Moral courage. Let's just look now of some of these, how these translate into action, de Gaulle in action. Well, I think what he did in 1940 is a perfect exemplar of those last points. It's an act, this man is in France, he just cannot accept the defeat, he goes to London and he makes a famous speech. It's an act of extraordinary moral courage and of disobedience, but also, and it's therefore it's a Bergsonian act if you want, but it's also underpinned by an analysis. A speech of 9 minutes where he basically explains why the French don't need to despair, because this is going to be a world war. American might, American economic power, the British Empire, British Army will win what is going to be a world war. So this is reflection and action, if you want. Mystery and duplicity, which I started with. Well, what is the best example of mystery and duplicity? It's the Algerian War. There you are, the Pieds Noirs, you know, the settlers in Algeria. De Gaulle stands in front of them on the 6th of June 1958 and he says, I have understood you, je vous ai compris. What did he understand? Well, they thought he'd understood that Algeria would always remain French. What I think he'd understood was Algeria was not going to remain French, but he couldn't say it yet. Also, but with that duplicity, in Algeria went an extraordinary pedagogy, taking the people with you. These extraordinary press conferences and televised speeches where he explains, wonderful speech where he says, it's entirely natural to feel nostalgia for the empire, as we can regret the gentle light of oil lamps. But there is no value in a policy that does not take account of realities. Vision and reality, the recognition of communist China in 1964, partly to annoy the Americans, but partly because he saw that it was absurd, as it were, to deny the reality of the existence of communist China. The Fifth Republic, it seems to me, is very much a technocratic, it's often seen by people as it were the triumph of technocracy. That takes us back to the organizational stuff I talked about. Respect for the experts. One of the things most surprised me when I wrote my book on de Gaulle was that this man actually listened to people. He actually listened to his experts. One of the first things he does on coming to power in 1959, he's presented with a very radical program of economic reform by the liberal economist Jacques Rueff, and de Gaulle thinks, God, this is dangerous, do I dare do it? So he takes in somebody from the Minister of Finance and he says, tell me, you've got one night, sleep on it, he says. If you tell me that this plan has a 2/3 chance of success, I'll adopt it. Tell me tomorrow morning. Goetz comes back in the morning and says, yeah, I think it does. He says, okay, we'll adopt it. So it's about listening, reflecting, and then acting. But, and there's a big but, as President of the Fifth Republic, his interest, what was his main interest? What was his main ambition? And that's why I wish I weren't in this panel, not because of my distinguished panelists, but because the idea that de Gaulle, the idea that we should be in a panel on the leadership of the free world would have de Gaulle turning in his grave, because he didn't believe in the free world, he believed in France. He believed during the whole period of the he believed basically in the primary of states. All ideologies are just cloaks for national ambition. Churchill was very startled one day during the Second World War when de Gaulle was behaving particularly impossibly, and Churchill said to him, oh, why can't you just, we're all on the same side. De Gaulle said, we're not on the same side. He said, yeah, we're allies. We want the victory of the Allies against the Germans. He said, well, I don't want the victory of the Allies, I want the victory of France. In other words, he was with the Allies, but he was with the Allies because it was going to be the victory of France. So he was, the whole idea of the world in two blocks, the Cold War, was antithetical to him. He never talked about the Soviet Union. He always talked about Russia. He said that Russia will absorb Bolshevism like blotting paper absorbs ink. Once he said to Macmillan, you speak of the socialist and capitalist camps. I don't really see much difference between them. They're both very dependent on technology. I think in time the differences between capitalism and socialism will disappear. He was very happy to chat to Ceausescu in May 1968, while the students of Paris were revolting. He could therefore lecture the Americans on the Vietnam War because he could see the Vietnam War not as a crusade against communism, but simply as a struggle for national liberation. He wanted to go beyond the Cold War for two reasons. One, because bipolarity froze out the chance of action for smaller countries, of which France was one. And secondly, he didn't believe, because he believed in national egoism, he once said to Eisenhower, how can we, and to Kennedy, how can we believe that be sure that the Americans will come to the rescue in France in extremis? Why should they? It's not in their national interest. Think of the two last world wars where they didn't. In other words, he wanted to recalibrate the NATO alliance. He wanted he wanted to rethink the NATO alliance. He wanted and what he was seeking for was a middle way, a kind of European political defense organization which would free France from the dependence on NATO. A complete failure, utter failure. He didn't succeed for lots of reasons. One of which I think is because in the end he couldn't seduce the Germans away from their dependence on the Americans, and so on. So was he a failure? Well, I don't want to end on a bad note, as it were. Not that I'm necessarily into the heroization of de Gaulle. It seems to me that the greatness of de Gaulle lies in words. And words, we talked about myths. We began with myths, actually, yesterday. And myths, we agreed, were very, very important. And he was a great myth maker in the best sense of the word. He told the French stories about themselves, which made them feel better and which are important. And one of the stories, they were both lies. And he knew they were lies, but they had to be told. The second story was that the French nobly and generously gave up Algeria as a sign of their commitment to human rights and so on. Of course, the French lost the Algerian War and were basically forced out, and de Gaulle knew that perfectly well. And the other big story is the role of the resistance and him in the role of the Free French in the liberation of France. De Gaulle knew perfectly well that without the Free French, France would have been liberated by the Americans and the British. He knew it well, but it was important to insert France into that narrative, to say that someone was always saying it, and therefore I still hold to the last words of my book on de Gaulle: he saved the honor of France. Thank you.
Thank you. His writings in the 20s and 30s, well, that's unusual for French generals. Or did all these generals have the same kind of ideas and writings and idea theories?
Well, no, I mean he was very unusual in his cerebralness, if that's the word, which is why in the 1920s Pétain, who was the most distinguished sort of military figure of the First World War, took de Gaulle into his cabinet to help him write a book on the French army, because de Gaulle had developed a reputation as a good writer and an intellectual and a thinker. In the 30s, the most controversial book he wrote, however, it was a tradition to write books. General Weygand, who got elected to the Academy Française, wrote a rather banal book on the history of the French army and so on. But de Gaulle's very unusual in that sort of condensed, slightly pretentious, actually, sort of philosophical reflection that he engages in. The thing that really made him unpopular in the 30s was the book, I didn't write to talk about, which he wrote about the future warfare, the importance of developing heavy armored divisions and so on, and he was less prescient than he seems, but he was quite prescient nonetheless.
You did forget the important 9th point on leadership: never rule a country with 246 different cheeses.
362, 400. I think there are more. Yes, that's great. Yeah, no.
He was funny as well.
He was hilarious. One of my colleagues was always saying to me when I was writing my book on de Gaulle, "Oh God, poor you're stuck there with this boring man." I said, "There's so many jokes." And every time I used to see in the corridor, she'd say, "A good joke today," and I'd say, "Well, the jokes all depend on context," and they never quite worked when I tried to tell her. But he could be very funny. He was a great showman, which I think the word showman obviously is rather anachronistic, but one of his 9 points would have been, as he was a charismatic output leader. Thanks.
Andreas Rödder. Can I say on the super civil servant Konrad Adenauer?
Yes, a very experienced and astonishing man. So never talk about the age of any political leader before considering Konrad Adenauer. The super civil servant was at the age of 57 when he was kicked out of his life job as Lord Mayor of the city of Cologne by the Nazis. He was 69 when he abandoned his early retirement and started his political comeback. And when he took on his new job as the West German founding chancellor, he was slightly younger than Metternich and Bismarck had been when they had left office. And when he was forced to retire, Adenauer still, you might not believe it, was 11 months older than Joe Biden would be at the end of a second term. So Adenauer's chancellorship lasted for 14 years, and thus was one of the longest lasting democratic governments ever, longer than Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, longer than any British prime minister since Robert Salisbury, and any French president since Napoleon III, only more recently to be exceeded by Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel, obviously reflecting a German preference for very long-lasting governments. Konrad Adenauer was the second of two politicians who dominated German politics in the middle third of the 20th century. The other one, 13 years younger than Adenauer, was Adolf Hitler. While Hitler's duodecennial regime ended in conflagration, when Adenauer left office in 1963, West Germany had become a respected player within the Western world on a scale which nobody would have expected when Germany unconditionally surrendered in 1945. And this was due to three revolutionary developments which I would like to show you. First, domestic stability through a new catch-all party. Second, economic prosperity and social stability through the model of social market economy. And third, a fundamental change of foreign orientation by a decided integration with the West. So let's start with the domestic side with the new catch-all party. Dating from the 19th century, the German party landscape had been fragmented, and one of its major cleavages in the country of the Reformation had been the denominational one. This fragmentation was one of the reasons for the instability of the Weimar Republic, which gave way to the Nazi Party, which in fact was the first catch-all party, which was forbidden by the Allied Control Council in October 1945. Now, forging the CDU as a trans-confessional party meant a revolutionary innovation which might be difficult to be estimated today, but turned out to be fundamental when 96% of the population were members of a Christian church. And still, that the CDU served as the crucial institution for political integration of the center-right hints at the continuing relevance of this innovation for German democracy and liberty. Talking about integration leads us to another challenge for the new democracy and for Adenauer: to cope with the Nazi past. Adenauer governed a country full of former offenders, followers, and opportunists, and as an utter realist, he knew about the unreliability of his compatriots. And he knew that he had no other people. Thus, Adenauer expected opportunism from former opportunists, adaptation to the newly established democracy and its institutions, but no more. Adenauer's personal integrity as an opponent to the Nazi regime was beyond doubt, and he did a lot to build up relations with the State of Israel, for example, through the Reparations Act from 1952. But domestically, he prioritized the stabilization of the German democracy and banked on pragmatism. So, regarding domestic stability, what Adenauer hands down is a readiness to compromise and to set priorities. The second fundamental development, after 30 years of destruction and hardship, lies in the German model of the so-called social market economy. Basically, this means what Gösta Esping-Andersen has called the conservative corporatist continental European model, which he distinguished from an egalitarian Scandinavian as well as from a competitive Anglo-American model. However, the model had to be established, and this was not at all a no-brainer in the beginning. After the war, within the Christian Democratic Party, ideas of Christian socialism were widely popular. Adenauer, himself rather a pro-market liberal, helped Ludwig Erhard, the political father figure of German ordo-liberalism, to prevail. However, Adenauer was also ready to make concessions, as with the reforms of pensions for the sake of the election victory in 1957. This German model was always a question of balance between economic competitiveness and social welfare. And in its best times, it managed to square the circle. However, it developed its own anti-cyclic. When the German model was adored, you could be sure that it was missing necessary reforms. And when German crisis was complained, you could trust that reforms were already on their way. Thus, the current complaint about German decline might be a good sign that the country could be prepared for another round of necessary reforms. Unfortunately, history is never an ultimate, and historical experience never provides reliable forecast. However, what the history of Adenauer and the social market economy provide is a balance of principles and pragmatism, opposed to absoluteness and dogmatism. Becoming a liberal democracy and so successful social market economy, however, was not only a consequence of domestic decisions. It was part of a third revolutionary change, the integration with the West. It was no later than October 1945 that Adenauer was convinced the division of Europe between a Russian-occupied Eastern Europe and Western Europe was a hard fact. I quote, "Only an economically and culturally sound Western Europe, led by England and France, can prevent further Asian encroachment. Needing to include and to fix up the non-Russian occupied part of Germany and requiring support from the US." One might argue that Adenauer's insight from late 1945 preceded the turn of Western assessment from Cannon's Long Telegram to NSC 68. When West Germany followed the interests of security, liberty, prosperity, reunification, sovereignty and resurgence as an equal European power, this circle, however, was not to be squared. The newly founded West German state, still under occupation regime, might not have had a wide variety of options at hand. However, Adenauer did two things. Firstly, he set priorities and prioritized security. Thus, he opted for an insoluble integration with the West, not from vassalage, as Macron would say, but from strategy. Modern Germany had been the middle kingdom in Europe, but not as a gravitation center, but as a buffer zone up to the 19th century, as a half-hegemonic empire and nervous great power after 1871, as a humiliated and revisionist power after 1919, and finally as the desolator of Europe. When Adenauer aspired to turn Germany into a reliable part of the West, he combined realpolitik and interests with a tectonic shift of German and European politics. Having set his priorities, secondly, Adenauer resolutely executed them, particularly by NATO membership and rearmament, and against heavy opposition. My own grandfather, a soldier in the Second World War and having come home with the conviction of never again, left the CDU when Adenauer embarked on rearmament. 3 years before, in 1952, Stalin had offered German reunification in return for neutrality. What many welcomed as a chance, Adenauer saw as a threat to West German security. He always and primarily saw Russia and the Soviet Union as the menace of world revolutionary communism and autocratic expansionism. His assessment as Asian or anti-Christian seemed somewhat obsessive, manipulative, since it diverted attention from the German Nazi past, and not very imaginative. Having said that, in 2023, this estimation seems more reasonable than at times when Germany believed in change through trade. Anyway, turning down Stalin's offer earned him the allegation to have missed the opportunity and to have squandered the chance for reunification. Whatever Stalin's motives might have been, regarding reunification, the revisionist West German raison d'etat, with constitutional status, Adenauer subordinated it to Western integration. He sustained the claim for reunification and deferred its operationalization. He built on the magnet theory, whereby someday the GDR would collapse and, attracted by a strong West, accede to the Federal Republic. This expectation increasingly got out of touch with political realities in the 60s, and at the end of Adenauer's chancellorship, reunification receded into the distance, to be followed by the historical irony that the magnet theory turned out to be the blueprint for German reunification as it happened in 1989 and 90. So looking at Adenauer's leadership, he placed priorities and principles over popularity. And he tried to combine realpolitik and values, national interests and international cooperation. The multilaterally integrated cooperative nation-state marked the fundamental innovation in European history and the game changer of European politics after 1945. When Adenauer engaged with West European integration, he took into account the German situation of powerlessness, and he realized that integration would serve as a tool for combining West German resurgence to an equal power in Europe with a French interest in security against Germany. And even if it was not actively driven by, it was founded in a moral conviction to overcome centuries of violent great power antagonism in Europe. This was no less true for Helmut Kohl. Let me finally compare Adenauer to those who outdated him, Kohl and Angela Merkel. Kohl followed a set of core convictions: family politics, transatlantic relations, European integration and reconciliation with France. In 1983, Kohl implemented the NATO dual-track decision against fierce domestic opposition, as Adenauer had done with rearmament in 1955. And regarding reunification, Kohl always kept the claim, but then acted vigorously when the unexpected opportunity emerged. He understood European integration as a lesson of the history of wars, particularly between France and German territories. Kohl himself came from one of those historical battlegrounds. His uncle, Walter, had died in the First World War, his brother, Walter, in the Second, and Kohl named his own son Walter. Even if Kohl followed a somewhat naive idea of the United States of Europe, he moderated the transition from Cold War to post-Cold War Europe due to an underlying and indispensable idea of history. Angela Merkel worked hard to hold things together and keep Europe running. As in the Euro debt crisis, she was good at realizing what was unrealistic. But she was bad at considering what might be possible. And she was unable to think in scenarios. An utter pragmatism without strategy led into a series of incoherent decisions, from energy politics to Russia. The German need for the Zeitenwende finally was a result of this lack of indispensable priorities. So Adenauer was no thinker or writer, no theorist, but a performer of leadership and statecraft. And so we have to conclude the lessons he might teach us. Here is the advice for sustainable leadership: balance and reconcile antagonisms, national interests and universal values, realpolitik and strategy, pragmatism and principles. Beyond that, this is the lesson for great leadership. Think strategically and let history open your mind. The future is open and it's shapeable. Allow for the improbable and imagine what might be possible. And this, finally, is the essence of exceptional leadership. Identify indispensable priorities. They won't be very many, but stick to them against all odds. Place substance over popularity. Leaders do not follow, they lead. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one question. What was Adenauer's view on himself, his role in history?
A deep sense of an obligation to bind Germany, West Germany, and Germany to the West in the end. And he was deeply worried that his successors would gamble away this German integration into the West.
Well, thank you, Andreas. Fredrik. Fredrik Logevall on J.F. Kennedy.
3 days ago, the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman concluded his column with the following sentence. It is impossible to exaggerate what a dangerous moment this is for our country. It is impossible to exaggerate what a dangerous moment this is for our country. Our country, of course, is the United States. I don't always agree with Tom Friedman, but I read Tom Friedman with profit. And in this case, I think he's correct. It's impossible to, and I say that as both a historian of the United States and now a resident, longtime resident. I'm Swedish by birth, nationality, but I'm also American. And I think Friedman is correct. I think there are other countries in what we're calling in this panel the free world who are also experiencing deepening divisions, deepening mistrust. But I suggest that the problem is worse in the United States. And this is a moment that calls for leadership. And that, of course, is the focus of our seminar, wonderful seminar this weekend, and also this panel. I'm writing a 2-volume biography of John F. Kennedy, Life and Times, as they say, of JFK. And I want to talk for a few minutes today about the example that I think he has for us, the way he speaks to our present moment. I won't talk so much today about Kennedy and statecraft, which is also a theme, though I think he has something to teach us about that too. It's about 6 decades, as we all know, since that sunny day in Dallas, Texas, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It'll be 60 years this fall. But he remains an outsized figure, not only in America, but elsewhere. People of a certain age in this country and elsewhere know all about him. He's an iconic figure, known universally by his initials, more recognized, I would say, in terms of his appearance, his face, more recognized than all but a handful of 20th century world leaders. He enjoys the highest, this is interesting, he enjoys the highest approval rating of any post-war American president, both while he was in office and after the fact. Even before his assassination, far more Americans claimed to have voted for Kennedy than actually did so. It's a little bit like Woodstock 1969. If everybody who said they were at Woodstock actually were at Woodstock, there'd be millions of people there. And he's still, this is a little bit, Julian was referring to de Gaulle in this respect, but he still matters, Kennedy does, for Americans. And so the question is, what explains this hold of Kennedy's legacy? What explains his lasting appeal? Does it have something to do with his youthful and dignified bearing, his handsome looks? Yeah, I think it does. Does it have something to do with the glamour of his White House and his beautiful family? Yeah, that too. What about his inspirational speech-making? I think that matters as well. And no doubt, he retains his hold on us partly because of the nature and suddenness of his death, the timing and the tragic circumstances of his death. Captured on film, it plays on a kind of endless loop in our minds. He's forever in his mid-1940s, seemingly in the prime of life. All of these things matter. But as I research and write this 2-volume biography of Kennedy and his times, I'm increasingly convinced that more than anything, it was Kennedy's abiding faith in his nation and in his brand of democratic politics that explains most fully his abiding legacy. And I want to talk just for a few minutes about that, including with respect to his remarkable inaugural address. I should say, by the way, parenthetically, that I'm quite conscious of Kennedy's shortcomings, maybe especially as a husband, and they will come out in the book. And also his policy judgments. He made mistakes on certain policies. Often they were well-reasoned. I give him high marks overall in terms of his decision-making, but we could talk, for example, about Vietnam, we could talk about Cuba, we could talk about civil rights. There are shortcomings there too. But the inaugural address, I commend it to you if you haven't read it recently, or better yet, go to YouTube and watch the inaugural address. It's an extraordinary address for a number of reasons. Not least because of the length. It's 1,360 words or thereabouts. Not a word wasted. And of course, it has the most famous line he ever wrote or delivered. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. This is potent stuff. Hundreds of thousands of Americans heard that line in that inaugural address and packed up and went to Washington to contribute to this thing called American democracy. And through his visionary leadership and his inspired rhetoric, Kennedy, I believe, summoned the narrative of American hope as he challenged people to believe in a better society at home while embracing the nation's leadership position abroad. He impressed upon Americans, and indeed others around the world, the importance of believing in something other than yourself. Ask not, or as we might say in Swedish, fråga inte. It's powerful. He understood, I believe Kennedy did, that good faith bargaining based on mutual concessions is essential to a functioning democracy. He understood that dignity, acting in a dignified manner, treating others appropriate to their dignity, is a core value of democracy. Dignity. Prudence, which we've heard about already in this panel, he knew was important. A sense of history matters. You know, I have a simple test for leadership, for political leadership. Is the person serious? Is the person serious? Is the person serious about the job? Serious about the office that they hold? Do they have the discipline and the maturity to discern matters that transcend self-interest? Can they put aside ego and emotionalism? Can they act with prudence and self-restraint? Can they listen? I think these are increasingly urgent questions in this summer, late spring, summer of 2023, certainly in the United States, but elsewhere too. Donald Trump, not serious. Boris Johnson, not serious. The four leaders we're considering on this panel, I would say, serious. Tage Erlander, serious. John F. Kennedy was serious. Beneath all the style and the glamour was basically a serious man on a serious mission. He was at once a realist and an idealist, because like all philosophic liberals, whether they be on the left side of the spectrum or on the right, he understood that people have selfish interests. But he believed in democracy and open conversation because he had confidence in the ability of people, the capacity of people to define their own lives, to care for people other than themselves, and to keep society progressing. He has certain things in common here, by the way, I would say, with our fourth president in the United States, James Madison. He was a similar mix, I would say, of idealism and realism. We need such leaders today. Will we get them? It's a big question. I want to believe that we will. I'm an optimist, I think, ultimately about my adopted country. If not in the long term, then if not in the medium term, then in the long term. I think we will have leaders who believe, with JFK, that through engagement and goodwill, we can make real and lasting connections across differences. We will still have our differences. Differences are important. They're inevitable. But we can make connections across them. We will have leaders who get that society is not a zero-sum game, but a conversation and a negotiation. Leaders who have a sense of egalitarianism. This is one of the things I love about my home country, Sweden. Even if that sense of egalitarianism arguably is fraying also in this country, I believe it's much stronger, it runs much deeper than in the United States. Leaders who understand that in the house of democracy there can be no enemies, who get that when politicians treat each other as enemies, honest bargaining becomes impossible, and debate within the chamber becomes as venomously personal as it is politically meaningless. Leaders who convey a sense of empathy. I was going to focus today in my remarks on empathy, and I decided not to, but I do want to mention it. That is to say, leaders who embody a kind of patriotism that doesn't transcend partisanship, but enriches partisan struggle, making it always an invitation for others to join you. It's another way of saying that we will not give up on one another in the United States or elsewhere, in Sweden, say. Because the country that ties us together also gives us the power to remake it in a better way, a way that a patriot may feel is truer to itself. My Harvard colleague, Jim Kloppenberg, has a powerful phrase on this. He speaks in his book, a book called Toward Democracy. He's one of our best historians of democracy. He speaks about an ethic of reciprocity, which implies a mutual respect, recognition, and tolerance for one another, even if we do not all share the same moral commitments. Politically, it means a willingness to allow your worst enemies to govern if they win an election. That's an ethic of reciprocity. So that's my conclusion this afternoon about John F. Kennedy and the promise of democracy. Kennedy reminds us that there was an age, not that long ago, when it was possible to believe that politics could speak to society's moral yearnings and be harnessed to its highest aspirations. When it was possible to think in terms of the social whole, of the public good, of the need to emphasize what Americans, in his case, what Americans have in common over what sets them apart. I've tried to suggest that this is a message that we need, ladies and gentlemen, both in the United States and in Sweden. And I want to finish with one final thought, which is Kennedy's insistence on rational, fact-based discourse in public life. And here I want to just quote from an address that he was never able to give in Dallas, Texas. He was on his way to make these remarks at the Dallas Trade Mart when he was assassinated. He was going to say this: in a world of complex and continuing problems, in a world full of frustrations and irritations, America's leadership must be guided by learning and reason, or else those who confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible will gain popular ascendancy, and with their seemingly swift and simple solution to every world problem. We cannot expect that everyone will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to this nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrik. Thank you. Was Kennedy lucky to have a successor who finished the work of building the great society? Can we see Kennedy as the what man and the less admired Lyndon B. Johnson as the how man?
I think to a degree we can. I think there's no question that in terms of the actually enacting the great society, Johnson, as you suggest, is key. Kennedy's role in laying the foundation for that great society, I think, is often underestimated. And one of my tasks in the biography is to show the degree to which Kennedy laid that foundation. He may also be, in a sense, fortunate in his successor, in that Johnson is so associated with the Vietnam War that people can't help thinking, well, and this is, of course, the mother of all counterfactual questions, if Kennedy had lived, what would he have done in Vietnam? Mm-hmm. He didn't have to face those really difficult decisions on Vietnam that Johnson had to face. Mm.
What more are you adding in this volume on JF Kennedy, because so much has been written already?
Yeah. You know, there's a lot, and I think we have surprisingly few serious biographies that try to put Kennedy in context. So that's one thing I'm doing. I would say if I could single out one thing, Ulf, I want to suggest that he wanted to rethink the Cold War in a very fundamental way, not just in his final months in life, but in fact, from the moment that he took office, I think I'm going to be able to show new evidence, actually existing evidence that people haven't really tapped, to suggest that in fact Kennedy wanted the superpower relationship to be different than it was. He was deathly afraid of nuclear war, and wanted to move that relationship to a sounder footing.
Thank you, Fredrik. I invite Lord Moore to the stage on Margaret Thatcher.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Julian Jackson raised briefly the unpromising subject of de Gaulle and jokes and said that there were some good ones. And this can be a problem with Mrs. Thatcher, who's not known for her jokes. But being the fourth person in this panel, I will just tell you one thing she said, which was certainly witty. She attended a dinner where men kept congratulating one another in their speeches. And when it finally came to her, she was very fed up. And she said, I've just listened to 7 speeches by men, and all I want to say is that the cocks may crow, but the hen lays the eggs. And that, I think, was her very much expressing her character and her unique position. And I'm sorry I have no illustrations today, but I'm pleased to have this instead, because when I look at this remarkable creature, I think she's quite expressive of the way Margaret Thatcher, the impact Margaret Thatcher has had as the first woman leader in British society, and how much she loved being at the prow of the ship of state. And there's something about this posture which reminds me, though Mrs. Thatcher was always more fully clad than that. I'm not going to talk about Mrs. Thatcher in every respect. I'm going to concentrate on her in the Cold War, but I think that tells you a lot about her in general. And I want to go back to when she first became Conservative leader in 1975. And on this issue, as with economic issues and many issues, she wished to make a break with the past. And the fashion then was for détente. And she thought that the West was doing it from a position of weakness, and she was very worried about what was then called Finlandization. That's to say, the idea that Finland didn't dare do anything in order to survive, to ward off Soviet attack, and this would be a phenomenon that would spread throughout the West. And she immediately tackled this. She wanted to tackle the issue both in terms of great power relationships and defense relationships, and on a sort of moral plane. So she said this in her first major speech on the subject. When the Soviet leaders jail a writer or a priest or a doctor or a worker for the crime of speaking freely, it's not only for humanitarian reasons that we should be concerned. For these acts reveal a regime that is afraid of truth and liberty. It dare not allow its people to enjoy the freedom we take for granted. And a nation that denies those freedoms to its own people will have few scruples in denying them to others. So she saw it very much always in terms of trying to reach the people oppressed by the Soviet Union, as well as the more traditional interpower relationships, which she was also very interested in. And she shared a view with a man called Ronald Reagan, who she met for the first time in that year, and who at that time held no office, that the Soviets, in her phrase, and in her next big speech on this, are bent on world domination. And when she made her second speech, this absolutely enraged the Soviets. And Red Star, the newspaper of the Red Army, attacked her, and they satirized her, and they said, she's the Iron Lady. And they meant this as an insult, because how sarcastic, as Russian propaganda often is, and sexist. So she couldn't be an Iron Lady because she's a lady. It's just really comical to be an Iron Lady. You can be an Iron Chancellor, like Bismarck, that was the comparison they made, but not an Iron Lady. Mrs. Thatcher, and this was part of almost a breakthrough for her leadership, immediately seized on this. She could see exactly how this would help. And so she had a special dinner speech at her constituency association where she wore red, which she very rarely did, because red is the colour of socialism, so she normally wore blue. It's different in the United States. And she said, I stand before you tonight in my Red Star chiffon evening gown. You should watch it on YouTube, it's good. My face softly made up and my fair hair gently waved, the Iron Lady of the Western world, a Cold War warrior. Yes, I am an Iron Lady. After all, it wasn't a bad thing to be an Iron Duke. She's talking about the Duke of Wellington there. Yes, if that's how they wish to interpret my defensive values and freedoms fundamental to our way of life. So she stole from her opponents the best sobriquet she could possibly have to make herself known across the world, and of course one which dramatized not only her views and strength of character, but her sex. Very, very important always in the way she approached the issue. Then, of course, she won the election in 1979, and in 1980, early in 1981, Ronald Reagan became the President of the United States. And between the two of them, they were arguing to confront the Soviet menace in terms of the balance of nuclear power. And they succeeded between them and actually, as mentioned, helped by Helmut Kohl, in the installation of cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe and the defeat of CND and all of that. She won the Falklands War in 1982, which impressed the Soviets mightily as a sense that the British actually perhaps could do something military. And of course, she won the 1983 general election, partly fought on this issue, with the biggest majority that any Conservative government has ever got in the era of universal suffrage. Right, so that's the first 4 years of office. And then she realized that because she had achieved these things with Reagan, that it was time to bargain from strength. Because she was not, ideological though she also was realistic. And she loved to say she was a conviction politician, but actually she also was cunning, and that she would never love to say, but it was true. And she knew that this was the time to have dialogue, but the question was, with whom? And she went to the funeral of Yuri Andropov in February 1984 in Moscow and despaired because all these Soviet leaders hanging around mourning the great man were all very, very old, including his successor. And on the plane back, she sat down with a sort of sank into her seat and she said, "For God's sake, find me a young Russian." And the Foreign Office, which was not her favorite institution, actually did oblige, and they came up with Mikhail Gorbachev, who, remember, was not at that time the Soviet leader. He was likely to become the next Soviet leader, but he was not the Soviet leader. And she invited him to Chequers, her country residence, and there took place this extraordinary debate. Her press secretary told me that the very first thing she said to Gorbachev as she took him into the room was, I want you to know that I hate communism. And it was this was the sort of tone of the whole thing. And the extraordinary thing was that it was successful. And the reason for this was that they both liked the frankness, and they were talking rather like students, debating. When we're young, we tend to do that. And she was saying capitalism and liberty is so great and free markets are great. And Gorbachev was saying, no, that's cruel, it's beastly, everyone lives joyfully. He used the word joyfully in the Soviet Union. And she immediately took to him. It's always important in Mrs. Thatcher's relationships with world leaders, who were all virtually all men, as to whether she sort of, almost you could say, fancied them. Whether she thought they were manly men. And she thought this very much of Reagan, and she thought it very much of Gorbachev, who, in her words, had wonderful sparkly eyes, and a trust. Even in this, the time taken for this meeting was supposed to be 3 hours. It took 6 or 7. Talks, lunch, more talks, and she immediately came out and said the famous words, "This is a man we can do business with," and she then flew the most extraordinary week in her life. As Gorbachev left, she said, "Oh, tomorrow's China, and I haven't had my hair done." And she rushed out to get it done. And she then flew to China to talk about the Anglo-Hong Kong Agreement to Hong Kong, to talk to the Hong Kong people about that, and then to Camp David to talk to Reagan about many things, including trying to persuade him of the importance of Gorbachev. And when Gorbachev came to office in that year, he quickly saw, to use the words of one of his aides, he quickly saw Mrs. Thatcher as the shortest way to send a message to Washington. And this did establish a remarkable relationship with trust. Very deep trust with Reagan, though by no means always agreement. And actually quite a level of trust with the Kremlin. And this developed, and perestroika got going, and everyone got interested in Gorbachev. And perhaps the apex of it for her, as well as her great visit to Poland in 1988, was her visit to Moscow in 1987. Some of you will remember or have seen pictures of her with her fur hat and her camel hair coat in the snow and all this sort of thing. And it suited Gorbachev's turn to give her great freedom, which she'd never done before to a visiting Western leader. So she was allowed to move around the streets, meet people, and above all to be interviewed on Soviet television, where she completely wiped the floor with the two sort of apparatchik-type interviewers who were rude. And the Soviet people absolutely adored it, because they had never seen anything remotely like it. And the interesting thing is that she did it by attacking the regime with which she was trying to establish better relations. She didn't mince her words. And in these endless talks she had with Gorbachev, because they continued to argue at night, he moved rooms. I think he'd done this deliberately. And he said, here's, look at this painting. It was a painting of a rural scene after a storm with the sun now shining and everything a bit wet. And he said, this is like, Prime Minister, this is like our conversation with the light. And she looked, and of course she couldn't prepare this, and she said, yes, Mr. President, but the light is coming from the west. Which was smart. And so I think it is not an exaggeration to say that in this middle period, from 83 to 88, I would say, basically, which coincided with Reagan, and this was the double act was so powerful, she really was very, very important in changing the whole world situation and the Cold War. But then comes this very curious and difficult period for her, where she gets what she wants, but also what she doesn't want, as is often the way in the high politics and world affairs. And so the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and Mrs. Thatcher actually privately described it almost that day, I think, as a dagger in my heart. Because though she had called for, and she, in a way, very much, well, totally wanted the fall of the wall, she was very, very frightened of German reunification. And there were basically two reasons for this. One, I think, much exaggerated by her, and one more powerful. She thought that German nationalism would return. This was a serious fear of hers, and it was obviously a fear worth having, but I think it was exaggerated in her mind. But she also feared that if this happened, the Soviet Union and Gorbachev, whom she now had a close relationship with, would not be able to contain it. And there would be a conflagration, there would be war, there would be collapse. And what you might end up with is a neutral, united Germany, neutral in between Russia and the West, and therefore very dangerous for us. And you might also have a revanchist old Soviet or Russian movement, which in fact, of course, did nearly happen with a coup against Gorbachev the year after Mrs. Thatcher left office. So her fears were not unreasonable. And she also had this great issue of the nationalities, which started to come through, which, of course, we all now live with and have been suppressed under the Soviet Union. And she was very conflicted on this because she greatly believed in the liberation of, relatively easy, the liberation of Poland, Hungary, etc., once the Cold War ended, but also the Baltic states and Ukraine and so on. But she was very, very worried by how that might play out in terms of violence, collapse, etc. So she went, in June 1990, she went to speak to the parliament in Kiev, and she was given a rapturous reception. But she didn't actually say to them what they wanted. She didn't say, yes, go off and be independent. She said, please give Gorbachev more time, try to support his reforms, it's worth it, etc., etc. And so she, at the very end, what ought to have been the sort of apotheosis of her Cold War policy, I mean, she remained incredibly popular in the east of Europe, but she was actually frozen out towards the end by President Bush, with whom she didn't have such a good relationship as with Reagan, and by Helmut Kohl. And you could say that the sort of hinge, she got sort of caught by the hinge of history. So how does all that look now? Or rather, what might it tell us about where we are now? I think one of the things that Margaret Thatcher was very good at always, though she often preached optimism, she always retained a sense of threat. She always understood that institutions and freedom, free markets, liberty, were threatened by people who didn't like them for one reason or another. And this was the key reason, of course, for a high level of defense. And she got a very good memo from Charles Pole, her beloved private secretary, at the height of all this, when everyone was talking about the end of history. He said to her that, no, the 90s and beyond will mark, this is in January 1990, will mark the return of history, and the West will once again be confronting nationalism. And I think that what we can see, what happened with the West in the years that ensued after her fall and with the rise of Putin was that we did get pretty sleepy about all of this. We did sort of think, if you do think the history's ended, you will become negligent. And she was right. It doesn't end. It didn't end. And so, as was mentioned earlier, speaking about Adenauer and Merkel, not Adenauer, that the vulnerability on the energy front that you see under Angela Merkel has caused real trouble now in the Putin era. And of course, what we also discover about Russia is that the imperial desire, though it's no longer expressed in communist terms, is actually the doctrine of Putin. That's what his famous essay says. So, and it's only really on the February the 24th last year that we began to wake up to all of this. Thank you.
You read my body language.
I do, yes, unavoidably. I think what we now find is, in a way, what Mrs. Thatcher always hoped for, which is a Europe that is becoming active in defending its freedom. And that Europe is the sort of Europe she preferred to the tight Western European Union of old. The dynamism is coming from the Atlantic and from the east of that Europe, from the countries that are actually directly threatened by Putin. So now, just to end by going back to the beginning, the word Finlandization is reversing its meaning. It now stands for what's being strong in the West. And I hope very much that, I hope I'm the first person to suggest this, that we'll soon have the word Swedenization for the same reason. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles.
Sorry.
To go back to the start, what can be said about the Iron Lady and feminism, or at least about the Iron Lady and other women in politics?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher always said she wasn't a feminist. And she was very keen to be Mrs. Thatcher. Nowadays, if she was a politician, she would be Ms. Roberts, wouldn't she, which is her maiden name. And she adopted all the characteristic things of traditional patriarchal relationships and so on. But the thing is, she didn't believe in the equality of the sexes. She believed in the superiority of women. And the way to deal with this was to pretend that you accepted all the male conventions and then screw them. I mean, and that's how it worked. And when I was talking about this earlier, when I was trying to imagine myself in her shoes, suppose I'd been Prime Minister and I had been the only man in a cabinet of 20 women, how would I have behaved? I think I would have found it very exciting. I really would have wanted to impress them and persuade them and all the rest of it. And that's how she felt the other way around. She loved being not only the woman, but the only woman among all those men. And they jolly well had to listen to her. And that was just a constant thrill for her for an unprecedentedly long time.